What if the story you think you understand is the wrong one? What if the person everyone is pointing at isn't the mastermind, but the message? And what if the most chilling words in this entire case aren't about violence at all, but about money? I was paid to do this. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That single sentence, quiet, flat, almost empty of emotion, is the line that changes everything. Because people confess to crimes for many reasons. Fear, guilt, confusion, pressure. But people rarely confess to being paid unless there's something much bigger behind the scenes. So tonight, I want you to forget the headlines you think you remember. Forget the mugshots. Forget the quick conclusions. Forget the neat, comforting idea that this is a simple story with a clear villain and a clean ending. Because the deeper you go into this case, the more it starts to feel less like a family tragedy and more like a transaction. Let me ask you something directly. If a wealthy, powerful family is torn apart inside a multi-million-dollar estate, with no forced entry, no public warning signs, and an arrest made almost immediately, is that justice moving fast? Or is it something else moving faster? The story begins on a quiet Sunday night in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country. A place designed for privacy, for insulation, for silence. A place where people like to believe nothing truly bad can reach them. And yet, behind those gates, everything unraveled. Two bodies were discovered inside the main house. A husband and wife. Decades of marriage. Decades of shared power, shared secrets, shared history. Reduced to a single night that no one outside those walls was supposed to see. The discovery, we're told, was made by their daughter. Imagine that moment for a second. The stillness. The disbelief. The brain refusing to accept what the eyes are seeing. And then, almost immediately, something unusual happens. Instead of confusion, instead of uncertainty, instead of shock slowing everything down, a name enters the conversation. Not from investigators, not from forensic analysis, not from hours of questioning, but from inside the family itself. A dangerous family member, someone who should be a suspect. Those words matter more than people realize. Because in the earliest moments of a case, before evidence, before autopsies, before timelines are locked, narratives form. And once a narrative forms, everything else is filtered through it. So let's talk about the person that narrative landed on. The son, living not inside the main house, but close enough to be present and far enough to be separate. The guest house, independence or isolation, privilege or exile, convenience or containment. You tell me. He's arrested the same night. No prolonged search, no long manhunt, no public uncertainty, just charges. 2 counts. First degree. Fast. Clean. Final. Almost too final. And that's where the public story wants to end. Because it's easier that way. A broken son. A violent act. A tragic but contained explanation. Case closed. But here's the problem. When cases close too neatly, too quickly, you have to ask yourself, who benefits from speed? Because speed doesn't always mean truth. Sometimes it means control. Now let's pause for a second and talk about the phrase that brought you here. I was paid to do this. Those words don't belong to the public record. They don't appear neatly in official press statements. They circulate quietly, indirectly, through whispers, alleged leaks, unnamed sources. The kind of phrase that isn't meant to be heard by everyone. The kind of phrase that suggests leverage. Because payment implies agreement. Agreement implies negotiation. And negotiation implies at least 2 sides. So if this story involves payment, who was paying? And more importantly, why? Was it money? Was it debt? Was it access? Was it silence? Or was it something far more personal? This is where the story starts to matter, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Because when families operate at a certain level of power, their conflicts don't look like ordinary conflicts. They don't explode publicly. They don't spill into messy arguments on front lawns. They calcify. They go quiet. They turn transactional. Control replaces affection. Silence replaces resolution. And pressure replaces choice. Ask yourself this. If you grow up in the shadow of enormous expectation, a name that opens doors but also traps you, do you ever fully belong to yourself? Or are you always someone else's asset? Someone else's liability? Someone else's problem to manage? That question matters more than it seems. Because when investigators later focused on the son's mental state, his financial situation, and his living arrangement, something subtle began to emerge. Not proof, not innocence, but ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous in a system that prefers certainty, especially when there are reputations to protect, legacies to preserve, stories that must not spread. Think about the estate for a moment. High security, controlled access, predictable routines. Crimes in places like that rarely happen by accident. They happen because someone knows the rhythms. Someone knows when to move. Someone knows when not to. And knowledge is currency. Now let me ask you another uncomfortable question. If someone truly wanted to hurt this family, would the son be the end goal? Or would he be the easiest piece to move? Because in every complex operation, whether it's business, politics, or crime, the most visible actor is rarely the most powerful one. Sometimes they're just the one closest to the blast. This isn't about proving anything. It's about questioning everything. Why was the arrest so fast? Why was the narrative so clean? Why did the story lock into place before the public even knew what questions to ask? And why does that one sentence keep resurfacing? I was paid to do this. Not, I lost control. Not, I snapped. Not, I didn't mean to. Paid. As if this wasn't an emotional explosion, but an obligation. And obligations don't appear out of nowhere. They're created. They're enforced. They're collected. Which brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if this case isn't about rage? What if it's about leverage? What if the real story isn't who committed the act, but who set the terms? Because once you start looking at it that way, everything changes. The guest house stops being a detail and starts looking like a boundary. The confession stops being an ending and starts looking like a signal. And the speed of justice stops feeling reassuring and starts feeling strategic. And we haven't even reached the night itself yet. Because once you examine what allegedly happened in the final hours before everything fell apart, you'll start to see why investigators quietly admitted something felt off. But that realization didn't come first. First came assumptions. Then came accusations. Then came silence. And behind that silence, a timeline that refuses to behave. Because when detectives began reconstructing the final night, who moved, who slept, who knew what, one detail kept reappearing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just persistently. Something wasn't added. Something was removed. And once you see what that missing piece is, you'll understand why this story refuses to stay buried. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most important moment of this case isn't the arrest, but the hour before anyone realized something was wrong? Because that's where the story actually begins. Not with flashing lights. Not with handcuffs. Not with headlines screaming for answers. It begins in silence. A silence so complete that, according to later accounts, nothing seemed out of place at first. No alarms. No neighbors calling police. No frantic messages lighting up phones. Just another quiet night in a neighborhood designed to swallow sound and keep the outside world away. So let me ask you this. When something terrible happens in a place built for privacy, who notices first, the system or the people living inside it? On that Sunday night, the estate was exactly what it always was. Gates closed, cameras in place, routines intact. The kind of place where time moves slower and problems are handled behind doors that rarely open. Inside the main house, Rob and Michelle were reportedly spending the evening the way they often did, quietly. No public events. No scheduled visitors. Nothing unusual on paper. And that's important, because when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they found no sign of disruption before the moment everything changed. No reported arguments. No raised voices overheard. No sudden departures. Just normalcy. And normalcy can be the most dangerous disguise of all. Meanwhile, a short distance away, close enough to walk, far enough to feel separate, the guest house sat quietly. Lights on or off, music playing or silence. Those details would become obsessively debated later. But at the time, no one was watching closely. No one was supposed to be. Now here's where the story starts to split in two. On one side, there's the official version, a clean, linear account of events. A sequence that moves from evening to discovery with no ambiguity. A narrative that makes everything feel inevitable. On the other side, there's what doesn't fit neatly into that sequence. And that's what we're going to sit with. Because according to investigators, the timeline of the night looks simple. Too simple. At some point during the night, something happens inside the main house. The exact timing is unclear, but the result is devastating. By the time the next significant moment occurs, it's already over. The bodies are found later. And here's the first question you should be asking. Why later? If something violent happens in a shared family estate, why does time pass before anyone realizes something is wrong? Think about that. This isn't an apartment complex where neighbors are strangers. This isn't a sprawling city block with noise everywhere. This is a contained environment. Controlled. Familiar. Which means either no one noticed or no one was supposed to. Now imagine being the person who discovers what happened. Walking into a space that moments ago was familiar, comforting, even, and suddenly realizing something is irreversibly wrong. Your brain would fight it. Your body would freeze. Your sense of time would collapse. And yet, according to reports, the response that followed wasn't just emotional. It was directional, because almost immediately, attention shifts. Not outward, not inward, but towards someone specific. The son, living nearby, present on the property, already a known quantity. Now let's pause. Is it natural to think of the closest person first in a crisis? Of course it is. But is it natural to frame that person as dangerous before an investigation even begins? That's where things get complicated. Because the language used matters. A dangerous family member. Someone who should be a suspect. Those words don't express confusion. They express certainty. And certainty at the wrong time can reshape everything that follows. Once law enforcement arrives, the process accelerates. Statements are taken. The scene is secured. Attention narrows. And from that point on, the story starts moving very fast. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you ever seen a case where investigators slowed things down when the answer felt obvious? Rarely. When a suspect seems to fit the situation, proximity, relationship, access, the pressure to confirm that theory can quietly outweigh the pressure to challenge it. Especially when the alternative is messier. Especially when the alternative raises questions no one wants to answer. The arrest happens the same night. That detail alone should make you pause. Because first-degree charges are serious. They imply intent, planning, deliberation, not confusion or chaos. So how does law enforcement reach that conclusion so quickly? What evidence was already there? What assumptions filled the gaps? What questions weren't asked yet? Those answers aren't public. And that absence matters. Because what we do know is that the son didn't attempt to flee. No dramatic escape. No cross-country chase. No desperate last stand. He was there. And being there can mean two very different things. It can mean guilt, or it can mean proximity to a storm you didn't create. Now here's where the story takes a turn most people miss. Investigators later acknowledged that reconstructing the exact sequence of events inside the house was difficult. Not because of chaos, but because of order. Rooms weren't ransacked. There was no obvious struggle throughout the house. No signs of panic spilling from one space into another. Which raises a disturbing possibility. Whatever happened, happened quickly. And quickly doesn't always mean impulsively. It can also mean rehearsed. Think about the difference. An impulsive act leaves mess, noise, evidence of loss of control. A rehearsed act leaves containment. Now let's talk about timing. Because timing is where this story starts to fracture. At some point during the night, the main house goes quiet. Not suspiciously quiet, just still. Lights where they're expected. Doors where they should be. Nothing triggers concern. Until it does. And when concern finally arrives, it arrives all at once. Discovery. Shock. Police. And then, almost immediately, resolution. Or at least the appearance of it. But here's what doesn't get talked about enough. Between the last moment anyone remembers things being normal and the moment police are called, there's a window. A window of uncertainty. And inside that window, anything could have happened. Someone could have moved. Someone could have waited. Someone could have been told something. Someone could have been promised something. And that's where the phrase that keeps resurfacing begins to haunt the timeline. I was paid to do this. Because if you insert that sentence into the night, the entire shape of events changes. Suddenly, the night isn't about anger. It's about obligation. Not about losing control, but about fulfilling a role. And roles require structure. They require instruction. They require timing. They require someone else setting the terms. Ask yourself this. If someone was being paid, when did the payment discussion happen? Earlier that day? Earlier that week? Earlier that year? And who knew about it? Because payments don't exist in isolation. They leave trails, emotional, financial, psychological. Which brings us back to the guest house. That space wasn't just physical separation. It was symbolic separation. Close enough to monitor. Far enough to isolate. And isolation is fertile ground for pressure, for persuasion, for dependency, for fear, especially if someone feels trapped between loyalty and survival. Now imagine the final hours through that lens. Imagine someone waiting, checking the time, thinking about consequences, not screaming, not panicking, just waiting. And then imagine the aftermath. Not relief, not escape, but collapse. Because if the payment was real, if the obligation was enforced, then the aftermath wouldn't bring freedom. It would bring exposure. And exposure is terrifying, which might explain something else investigators quietly noted. The son's demeanor. Not explosive, not chaotic, flat, controlled, almost resigned. Now I want to be very clear. This is not about declaring guilt or innocence. It's about understanding the shape of behavior. Because people who act alone often unravel afterward. People who act under pressure often shut down. They become compliant. They become quiet. They become containers for someone else's narrative. And that narrative can be very convenient, especially when it ends the story quickly. Now let's talk about what wasn't added to the official timeline. No confirmed motive released immediately. No clear explanation for escalation. No public discussion of outside influences. Just a family tragedy. Just a broken son. Just a terrible night. But real stories are never that clean. And investigators know that. Which is why, days later, internal discussions reportedly began shifting. Not publicly, not officially, but privately. Questions started surfacing. About the timeline. About access. About pressure. About that sentence. Because once a case involves the possibility of payment, it stops being just a family matter. It becomes a network. And networks are dangerous to expose. So here's where we leave this chapter. Not with answers, but with a realization. The night everything changed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't messy. It was controlled. And control doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from preparation, from leverage, from someone knowing exactly when to act and when not to. And when investigators finally started asking themselves who else might have been involved, not emotionally, but structurally, the case took a direction no one outside those walls expected. Because the next step wasn't about what happened inside the house. It was about who had access to the people inside the house long before that night ever arrived. And once you see that connection, the story doesn't just change. It destabilizes. Because what came next would force investigators to confront a possibility they were never supposed to consider. What if the most important witness in this case isn't a person at all? What if it's the space itself? Because buildings remember things people try to forget. They remember movement. They remember routine. They remember who belongs and who doesn't. And when investigators stepped onto the Brentwood estate that night, they weren't just entering a crime scene. They were entering a system, a carefully designed environment where every path, every door, every line of sight existed for a reason. So let's slow this down. Because speed is what buried the questions the first time. The estate wasn't just expensive. It was intentional. Gated access, layered security, clear divisions between public-facing areas and private zones. This wasn't a house you wandered through by accident. You had to know where you were going. And more importantly, you had to know where you weren't supposed to go. The main house sat at the center of the property. That's where life happened. Meetings, dinners, quiet evenings, decisions that didn't leave a paper trail. And then there was the guest house. Close enough to be convenient. Far enough to be separate. A space that could be described in two very different ways, depending on who is telling the story. Independence or containment. Ask yourself this. When a family chooses to house an adult child on the same property, but not under the same roof, what does that say? Is it generosity? Is it boundaries? Or is it supervision without proximity? Because proximity is powerful. Proximity allows for access, but distance allows for control. You can monitor without engaging. You can provide without involving. You can isolate without exile. And isolation is quiet. The guest house had its own entrance, its own routine, its own rhythm. Someone could come and go without passing through the emotional center of the home, which sounds harmless, until you realize what that means during a crisis. Because in a moment of chaos, Separation creates plausible deniability. Now let's talk about movement. Investigators later mapped the property carefully, and compliance leaves a different kind of scene, a quieter one. Now consider the guest house again. Separate structure, separate routine, separate psychological space. If pressure was being applied, financial, emotional, psychological, the guest house becomes more than a living space. It becomes a staging area, a place to think, a place to wait, a place to be alone with fear. And fear, when isolated, grows teeth. Especially if someone believes the consequences of refusal are worse than the consequences of action. Ask yourself this. If someone came to you and said, "You have to do this, or else," where would that conversation happen? Not in the main house, not in shared spaces. Somewhere quiet, somewhere contained, somewhere no one else hears. Like a guest house. Now let's shift perspective. From the outside, the estate looks like safety. But from the inside, it might feel like surveillance. Cameras watching, routines monitored, expectations enforced. And if someone felt trapped within that system, supported but controlled, the estate stops feeling like a home. It starts feeling like a perimeter. And perimeters can be breached from the inside. That's why investigators didn't just look at where the bodies were found. They looked at the paths. Who could move without being seen? Who could approach without raising alarms? Who could leave without being followed? And the answer kept pointing back to familiarity. Not intrusion, not invasion. Access. Now here's the detail most people overlook. The estate didn't show signs of defensive preparation that night. No emergency calls placed early. No attempts to secure rooms. No evidence of escalating fear, which suggests something critical. Whatever happened didn't feel dangerous until it was too late. And that only happens when the threat doesn't look like a threat, when it looks like family. Now think about that phrase again. I was paid to do this. If that sentence belongs anywhere, it belongs in a place like this. A place where money, power, and silence intersect. A place where transactions don't look like transactions. They look like family discussions. They look like problem solving. They look like handling things. Because families with resources don't fight the way ordinary families do. They negotiate. They manage. They control outcomes. And sometimes, that control slips. Now imagine the estate as a chessboard. Every piece has a role. Every square has meaning. The main house is the king. The guest house is the knight. Close, flexible, underestimated. And someone moves the pieces. Quietly, deliberately. Now here's where the estate gives up one of its most unsettling secrets. Investigators later noted that there were windows of time where movement wouldn't be captured clearly. Not because cameras failed, but because coverage overlapped imperfectly. Blind spots. Not obvious ones. Not careless ones. But functional ones. And functional blind spots are often accepted, even designed, because they preserve privacy. But privacy cuts both ways. It protects, and it conceals, which raises the question no one wants to ask. Did someone know exactly when those blind spots existed? Because if they did, then the estate wasn't just a setting. It was a tool. Now let's step back. Why does this matter? Because if the estate itself enabled silence, containment, and access, then the story isn't just about a person making a choice. It's about an environment that made that choice possible. And environments don't act alone. They're shaped by decisions, by people, by priorities. Which brings us to the next fracture in the story. When investigators began looking beyond the physical layout, beyond walls and doors, they started examining the relationships that moved through those spaces. Who had influence? Who had leverage? Who had something to lose? And that's when the focus quietly began to shift, away from where the act happened, and toward who might have shaped the conditions for it long before that night ever arrived. Because buildings don't kill people, but they can hide the hands that do. And once investigators started mapping not just the property, but the power dynamics that lived inside it, the case stopped being about a single night. It became about years. Years of pressure, years of expectation, years of unspoken agreements. And that's when a new question emerged, one that wouldn't be answered by forensics or floor plans. Who had access to the son's decisions? Because whoever controlled that controlled everything. And once investigators began pulling on that thread, they realized the estate wasn't just divided physically. It was divided emotionally. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because to understand how this situation reached a breaking point, You have to understand the person living in the space between privilege and isolation. The one everyone thought they knew. The one everyone assumed was the problem. But what came next would force everyone to reconsider whether he was the source of the chaos or the product of it. What if the person everyone thinks they understand is the one no one ever really listened to? Because reputations are loud, but inner lives are quiet. And in this case, the distance between the two may be the most dangerous gap of all. From the outside, the image was clean, predictable, almost scripted. The son of two powerful, well-known figures, raised in comfort, shielded from hardship, surrounded by opportunity. The kind of background people assume guarantees stability. But assumptions are lazy. And lazy assumptions are how complex stories get flattened into convenient villains. So let's slow down again. Because before the night everything changed, there were years that led up to it. Years of being watched. Years of being compared. Years of being defined by proximity to someone else's success. Ask yourself this. If your last name opens doors everywhere you go, but also erases you in the process, who do you become? Someone confident? Or someone constantly trying to prove they're real? Now, publicly, the son was often described in simple terms. Quiet, reserved, occasionally troubled. Nothing alarming, nothing headline-worthy. And that's exactly the problem. Because quiet people are often assumed to be uncomplicated. But silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means compression, pressure building inward instead of exploding outward. Now consider the environment he grew up in. High expectations, public scrutiny, private negotiations disguised as family conversations. This wasn't a household where problems were yelled about. They were managed, handled, reframed. And if you're the one being handled, your sense of agency slowly erodes. You begin to question your own instincts. You rely on others to define what's normal. You stop trusting your own reactions. And that kind of dependency is subtle. It doesn't look like control. It looks like care. Now let's talk about the guest house again, but this time psychologically. Living on the property, but not inside the home, sends a message, whether intentional or not. You're close, but not central. Supported, but not integrated. Independent, but still monitored. It's a liminal space. Not fully inside, not fully outside. And people who live in liminal spaces often struggle with identity, because they're never quite sure where they belong. Now imagine spending years in that space. Close enough to feel the weight of expectations. Far enough to feel the loneliness of separation. And then imagine facing a moment where someone offers you certainty. A clear instruction. A defined role. A way to stop the pressure, even temporarily. That's how leverage works. It doesn't force. It persuades. Now here's something rarely discussed publicly. People with powerful parents don't just inherit privilege. They inherit obligation. Unspoken rules. Invisible debts. Expectations that can never be repaid. And when those obligations collide with personal struggle, emotional, financial, psychological, the result isn't rebellion. It's compliance. Especially if compliance promises relief. Now think about how the public responded once the arrest was announced. Shock. Then certainty. The story made sense immediately. The troubled son. The tragic breaking point. The unthinkable act. People nodded. Commented. Moved on. Because it fit a narrative we already recognize. But what if that narrative was too easy? What if it ignored the slow erosion that happened long before that night? Because here's what rarely gets examined. When investigators later reviewed communications, routines, and behavior patterns, they didn't find chaos. They found consistency. No dramatic escalation. No explosive warning signs. Just someone moving through life in a constrained, controlled way. And that matters. Because people who snap tend to show fractures beforehand. Erratic behavior. Escalating conflicts. Visible instability. But what if instability is being managed quietly? What if it's being contained? What if it's being used? Now let's talk about money. Not in the sensational way, but in the quiet, practical way that actually shapes behavior. Living on a family property isn't free. It creates dependency. And dependency creates vulnerability. If someone controls your access to resources, housing, support, protection, they also control your options. And options are power. So ask yourself this. If someone feels they can't leave, can't refuse, can't say no, how free are their choices really? Now this is where that sentence starts to feel heavier. I was paid to do this. Because payment doesn't always mean profit. Sometimes it means survival. Sometimes it means relief. Sometimes it means escape from pressure that's been building for years. Now imagine being someone who feels trapped between two realities. On one side, a public image you can never live up to. On the other, a private reality you're not allowed to talk about. And then imagine someone offering you a third option. Do this, and things change. Do this, and the pressure stops. Do this, and the debt is settled. That doesn't excuse anything, but it explains vulnerability. And vulnerability is where influence enters. Now let's talk about demeanor again, because after the arrest, people fixated on how the son appeared. Calm, detached, almost numb. Some saw guilt, others saw shock. But there's another interpretation that's harder to confront. Resignation. The look of someone who believes the outcome was decided long before the moment arrived. The look of someone who followed a script and now waits for the consequences. Now think about interrogation rooms, about how power dynamics play out there. Someone already conditioned to defer, to comply, to accept authority. Someone who's been taught, implicitly, that resistance only makes things worse. If such a person is questioned aggressively, what happens? They don't fight. They agree. They accept. They internalize blame, especially if they believe doing so protects someone else. And that brings us to another uncomfortable possibility. Protection. Because when families are complex, loyalty doesn't always flow upward. Sometimes it flows sideways. Sometimes downward. Sometimes toward the people who apply pressure, not affection. And if someone believes they're protecting a sibling, or preserving a legacy, or preventing a larger disaster, they may accept a role they never wanted. Now let me ask you something directly. If you believed refusing would destroy everything you've ever known, would you still say no? Or would you convince yourself there's no choice? That question matters, because investigators later acknowledged, quietly, that understanding the son's internal world was far more complicated than the public realized. Not unstable, not explosive, constrained. And constraint changes behavior. Now here's where contradictions begin surfacing. Despite the narrative of a troubled individual, there was no clear evidence of a downward spiral. No public breakdowns. No obvious warning signs. No documented crisis that week. Which begs the question, if this was a spontaneous act, what triggered it? And if it wasn't spontaneous, who benefited from the timing? Because timing is everything. And the timing of this event didn't align with chaos. It aligned with opportunity. And opportunity doesn't appear randomly. It's created. Now let's talk about perception. Public image is a shield. It protects families from scrutiny. It simplifies stories. It makes uncomfortable questions seem unnecessary. And once the public accepted the image of the son as the problem, curiosity died. Which is convenient. Because while everyone was focused on who he was, very few people asked who he was listening to, who he trusted, who he feared, who had leverage. And leverage doesn't have to be loud. It can be subtle, persistent, quietly enforced. Now think about the phrase again. I was paid to do this. What if payment wasn't a suitcase of cash? What if it was the promise of stability, of forgiveness, of continued belonging? What if it was the illusion of control in a life where control was always just out of reach? Now let's look at how quickly the story solidified. Within hours, the public narrative locked in. Within days, speculation turned to condemnation. Within weeks, complexity vanished. And complexity is dangerous, because complexity threatens certainty. And certainty is comforting, especially when the truth might implicate more than one person. Now here's the turning point most people never hear about. At a certain stage, investigators began examining communications not just between family members, but between the son and people outside the immediate household. Advisors, intermediaries, individuals who operated quietly around the edges. Not friends, facilitators. And that's where things started getting uncomfortable. Because facilitators don't act emotionally. They act strategically. And if someone like that was influencing decisions behind the scenes, the entire story changes. Suddenly, the son isn't acting alone. He's acting within a framework he didn't design, and frameworks are hard to see until they fail. Now think about the moment after everything happened. The aftermath. If someone truly acted out of rage, the aftermath is chaotic. But if someone acted under instruction, the aftermath is hollow, empty, almost relieved, until reality catches up. And that hollow feeling is what some observers noticed. Not remorse, not anger, just absence, which is terrifying in its own way, because absence suggests disconnection, and disconnection suggests influence. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a person who doesn't fit neatly into the role assigned to him. Not a monster, not a mastermind, but not innocent in the simplistic way either. It leaves us with a question the justice system struggles with. At what point does influence become coercion? At what point does compliance erase choice? And at what point does accepting blame protect something larger? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they matter, because once investigators began asking them, the case stopped being about personality. It became about power, and power rarely leaves fingerprints. Which is why the next phase of the investigation didn't focus on who the son was, but on who else was present in his world, who shaped his decisions, who benefited from his silence, who stood to lose if he ever spoke freely. And when investigators turned their attention in that direction, they encountered resistance, quiet resistance, institutional resistance, narrative resistance, because pulling on that thread threatened to unravel more than one life. It threatened a structure, a legacy, a story that was supposed to end neatly. But it didn't, because just as the public settled into certainty, a new voice entered the story. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. And that voice would force investigators to confront a possibility they'd been avoiding from the start. That maybe the son wasn't the origin of the violence, but the endpoint of a chain that began long before the night everything changed. And once that idea took hold, nothing about this case felt simple anymore. What if the most powerful moment in this case wasn't the crime, but the first sentence spoken afterward? Because first words shape first beliefs. And first beliefs can lock an investigation onto a single path before anyone realizes there were other roads. So let's return to that moment. The moment the quiet finally broke. The moment the story moved from private to permanent. According to reports, it was the daughter who made the discovery. Think about that for a second. No matter who you are, no matter how prepared you think you might be, discovering something like that doesn't just shock you. It fractures you. Your brain scrambles. Time warps. Memory stutters. People don't behave correctly in those moments. They behave instinctively, which is why what came next matters so much. Because almost immediately, alongside shock and horror, something else entered the conversation. Direction. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Direction. A warning about a dangerous family member. Someone who should be a suspect. Now let me ask you a difficult question. In the immediate aftermath of trauma, how does someone arrive at certainty that fast? That's not a judgment. It's an inquiry. Because certainty doesn't appear out of thin air. It's built. Sometimes over years. Sometimes through whispered concerns. Sometimes through fear. Sometimes through stories told, so often they start to feel like facts. Now imagine being in a family where tension exists but is never addressed openly. Where concerns are expressed quietly. Where problems are managed rather than resolved. Where fear is allowed to linger without clarity. In that environment, perceptions harden. And when something terrible finally happens, those perceptions rush forward to fill the void. The brain reaches for the explanation it already knows. Not necessarily the truth. The familiar. So let's talk about the daughter's position in this family dynamic. She's not an outsider. She's not an observer. She's inside the system. Which means she's been exposed to years of narratives, warnings, and unspoken assumptions. Stories about who is stable, who is volatile, who can be trusted, who can't. And once those stories take root, they become lenses. Everything is seen through them. Now consider this. If, over time, someone had been framed within the family as unpredictable or dangerous, that label wouldn't suddenly appear on the worst night of everyone's lives. It would already exist. It would simply be activated. Now pause again. This isn't about blaming her. Trauma doesn't make people liars. It makes them human. But it does mean we have to ask whether early statements were expressions of truth or expressions of fear. Because fear speaks quickly. Fear doesn't wait for evidence. Fear fills silence with conclusions. Now think about how law enforcement receives information in those early moments. They're walking into chaos. They're trying to establish control. They're hungry for clarity. So when someone close to the victims offers a direction, especially one that aligns with proximity and access, it becomes gravity. Everything starts falling toward it. Now here's the part that complicates things. The daughter didn't just discover the bodies. She discovered the story. Because from that moment on, her words didn't exist. The explanation that says, this happened because of one person. Because the alternative is unbearable. The alternative is complexity. And complexity means no one is fully safe from scrutiny. Now let's examine what happens next. Once the statement is made, law enforcement pivots. Not because they're reckless, but because they're responding to information. And when information comes from inside the family, it carries weight, especially when it confirms an already plausible theory. Access, proximity, history, everything lines up, which means no one pauses to ask whether the narrative itself might be part of the problem. Now here's something most people never consider. When a family is under immense pressure, financial, reputational, emotional, fractures form. And those fractures don't just separate people. They shape perception. They decide who is believed and who is doubted, who is protected and who is exposed. And in some families, that role assignment happens quietly and early. Now imagine growing up in that system. Imagine being the sibling who is seen as fragile or unpredictable. Imagine watching others speak about you instead of to you. Imagine knowing, deep down, that if something ever went wrong, eyes would turn to you first. That knowledge changes behavior. It makes you cautious. It makes you quiet. It makes you compliant. And it also makes you vulnerable. Now let's talk about aftermath. After the discovery, the daughter's role becomes fixed in the public story. She's the one who found them. She's the one who spoke up. She's the one who pointed investigators in a direction. And that's a heavy role to carry. Because once the story hardens, there's no space to reconsider. No room to say, I don't know. No room to say, I was wrong. No room to say, I was scared. The narrative has moved on. And narratives, once they move, don't look back. Now here's where investigators reportedly began to feel uneasy, not because they doubted the daughter's pain, but because they realized something important. Her statement didn't just reflect the moment. It reflected a longer story, a story she'd been living with for years, which means her words, while sincere, might not have been neutral. And neutrality matters in investigations. Now ask yourself this. If someone genuinely believes they are preventing further harm by identifying a perceived threat, are they wrong? Emotionally, no. Procedurally, maybe. Because belief isn't evidence. And fear isn't proof. Now let's talk about how this impacted the son. Because from that moment forward, he wasn't just a suspect. He was a suspect named by his own family. And that changes everything. It isolates you instantly. It removes ambiguity. It frames every action you take afterward. Silence becomes guilt. Confusion becomes calculation. Compliance becomes admission. And if you were already conditioned to comply, what chance do you have? Now imagine being questioned under that weight. Not just by police, but by expectation. Everyone around you believes they already know the truth. So what do? Do you fight? Or do you accept the role assigned to you? And that's where this story takes another dark turn. Because once someone is cast as the problem within a family system, they often internalize it. They stop defending themselves. They stop trusting their own narrative. They begin to believe they deserve what's coming, especially if they think doing so protects someone else. Now consider the possibility that the daughter's certainty, however understandable, became a tool. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. It simplified the case. It accelerated decisions. It narrowed focus. And in doing so, it may have shielded other questions from view. Questions about influence, about leverage, about who benefited from the story ending quickly. Now let's be clear. This isn't about accusing the daughter of wrongdoing. It's about recognizing how trauma and family dynamics can unintentionally shape outcomes. Because systems don't require villains to fail. They only require assumptions. And assumptions, once embedded, are incredibly difficult to dislodge. Now here's where things quietly shifted. As time passed and the shock faded, investigators began rereading early statements. Not to challenge them, but to understand them. And when they did, they noticed something that hadn't stood out before. The certainty wasn't emotional. It was structured. It echoed things said before. Concerns raised earlier. Narratives already circulating. Which means the night of discovery didn't create those ideas. It activated them. And activation is different from invention. Now ask yourself this final question. If the first story told after a tragedy is shaped by years of fear and perception, how confident can we be that it reflects the full truth? That question haunted the investigation more than anything else. Because once investigators realized the family story predated the crime, they had to consider a possibility they'd been avoiding. That this wasn't just a crime that fractured a family. It was a family fracture that finally erupted into a crime. And fractures don't belong to one person. They spread, they deepen, they pull others in. Which means the daughter's role, as painful and sincere as it was, may have been one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that wasn't assembled that night. It had been forming for years. And when investigators began looking at those years, the conversations, the concerns, the quiet warnings, they uncovered something deeply unsettling. That the person everyone was watching might not have been the one shaping the story. Because the next phase of the investigation didn't focus on the crime scene. It focused on communication, on influence, on who was saying what to whom long before anyone called the police. And once investigators followed that trail, they realized the family narrative was only the surface layer. Beneath it was something far more calculated, something that suggested the story didn't start with violence. It started with words, and those words may have been steering everyone toward a conclusion that felt safe, but wasn't necessarily true. What if the most suspicious part of this case isn't what happened, but how fast everyone decided they understood it? Because justice is supposed to be careful, and careful takes time. But time is exactly what this case didn't get. From the moment police arrived at the estate, everything moved at a pace that left even seasoned observers uneasy. Statements were taken, the scene was secured, and almost immediately, attention narrowed, not outward, not cautiously, but decisively, onto one person. The son, arrested the same night. Let that sink in. No prolonged canvassing of the neighborhood. No public appeal for information. No days of uncertainty while evidence was processed. Just a straight line from discovery to detention. Now ask yourself a simple but uncomfortable question. When was the last time you saw a double homicide involving a wealthy, high-profile family resolved that quickly? It's rare. Not because police don't want answers, but because complex scenes take time to understand. Especially when the people involved have layered relationships, resources, and influence. Which makes the speed here stand out. Not as efficiency, but as urgency. And urgency can come from two places: confidence or pressure. So let's examine what could have created that pressure. First, proximity. The son lived on the property, close enough to be present, separate enough to be scrutinized. In law enforcement terms, that makes him a person of interest almost immediately. That part makes sense. Second, family direction. An early statement pointing investigators toward a dangerous family member doesn't just inform an investigation. It accelerates it. It creates a gravitational pull. Third, narrative convenience. A contained story is easier to manage than an open-ended one, especially when the story involves powerful names, intense media interest, and public expectation. Now combine all three. You get momentum. And momentum, once it starts, is hard to stop. Because stopping means questioning assumptions. And questioning assumptions means slowing down. Now let's talk about what first-degree charges actually imply. They're not casual. They suggest intent, planning, deliberation. They're not typically filed without a clear evidentiary foundation. So what was that foundation? That's the question that has never been answered publicly. We know there was access. We know there was proximity. We know there was a family narrative already in place. But access and proximity don't equal planning. And planning requires proof. So where did that proof come from? And how fast was it interpreted? Here's what investigators later acknowledged privately. Early evidence was circumstantial. Important, yes, but not definitive, which means the leap from suspicion to first-degree charges happened in a space filled with inference. Inference guided by pressure. Now imagine being an investigator in that moment. You're standing inside a multi-million-dollar estate. Two prominent figures are dead. Media attention is imminent. Family members are emotional. A suspect is nearby. You feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. Solve this fast. Contain this. Reassure the public. And if someone inside the family is already pointing you toward an answer, the temptation to accept that answer grows. Because hesitation looks like failure. Now let's talk about the interrogation window. Because that's where speed becomes most dangerous. When someone is detained quickly, before the full picture is understood, the questioning that follows often fills gaps with assumptions. Investigators ask questions framed by a theory, and theories shape answers, especially when the person being questioned is already conditioned to comply, already overwhelmed, already isolated, already convinced that resistance is futile. And if that person is told, implicitly or explicitly, that the story is already written, what incentive do they have to challenge it? None. Now think about the alleged confession again. I was paid to do this. If that phrase surfaced during questioning, imagine the reaction. Confusion, alarm, disbelief. Because that statement doesn't fit a simple family rage narrative. It complicates everything. It suggests outside influence, which raises a dangerous prospect for a case moving too fast. Because once you introduce the possibility of additional actors, facilitators, intermediaries, influencers, the investigation explodes outward. It becomes slower, messier, more politically sensitive. And that's exactly what speed tries to avoid. Now ask yourself this. If you were under pressure to resolve a case quickly, how would you handle information that threatens to complicate it? Do you lean into it? Or do you compartmentalize it? And compartmentalization is subtle. It doesn't require denial. It just requires postponement. We'll look at that later. Let's focus on what we can prove. Let's deal with the primary suspect first. And before you know it, later never comes. Now consider how quickly the public accepted the arrest. Headlines didn't ask questions. They announced conclusions. And public certainty feeds institutional certainty. Once the world believes a story, challenging it becomes risky. Because reversing course doesn't just affect a case. It affects credibility. Now here's another detail that rarely gets discussed. The speed of the arrest limited alternative exploration. Neighbors weren't interviewed as broadly. Peripheral contacts weren't prioritized. Financial angles weren't fully unpacked in the early phase. Everything focused inward. On family. On proximity. On psychology. And psychology is subjective, which makes it easy to interpret behavior through a predetermined lens. Now let's talk about behavior. After the arrest, observers noted how the son responded. No dramatic outbursts. No visible attempts to resist. No public declarations of innocence. Just compliance. And compliance can look like guilt, unless you understand the person. Because for someone conditioned to accept blame, compliance is a default, especially if they believe resisting would make things worse. Worse for themselves, or worse for someone else. Now imagine being told, directly or indirectly, that the story is already set, that your family believes it, that investigators believe it, that the public will believe it. What would you do? Fight the current? Or let it carry you? Now let's return to the phrase that refuses to disappear. I was paid to do this. That statement, if true, doesn't just complicate guilt. It complicates intent, because payment reframes motive. It turns emotion into transaction, and transactions involve more than one party, which means the moment that sentence enters the case, speed becomes the enemy of truth. Because transactions leave trails. Financial, communicative, behavioral. But following those trails takes time. And time is what this case didn't have, or didn't allow itself. Now here's something investigators later struggled with. Once charges are filed, momentum locks in. Evidence is interpreted through the lens of prosecution. Defense becomes reactive, and alternative theories are often framed as distractions rather than possibilities. Which means if something important was missed early, not maliciously, but structurally, it becomes harder to correct later. Now ask yourself this. Is it possible that the speed of the arrest protected the system from deeper scrutiny? Not intentionally, but functionally. Because slowing down would have meant asking uncomfortable questions. About influence. About pressure. About who else might be involved. And involvement doesn't have to mean physical presence. It can mean shaping choices. Creating conditions. Applying leverage quietly. Now consider the broader context. This wasn't just any family. This was a family with reach. With connections. With a public image worth protecting. And public image doesn't like uncertainty. It likes closure. Which brings us back to the decision-making process. When investigators act quickly, they often believe they're preventing further harm. But sometimes, they're preventing further discovery. Now think about how this played out. The arrest calmed the narrative. The story felt contained. The public exhaled. But beneath that calm, questions lingered. Why the rush? Why the certainty? Why the silence around alternative explanations? And those questions didn't go away. They just went underground. Now here's where things began to shift, quietly. As days passed, and the adrenaline faded, internal reviews began. Not reversals, not doubts, but unease. Certain details didn't sit right. Certain timelines felt compressed. Certain statements felt rehearsed, not in a deceptive way, but in a conditioned one. And that's when investigators started re-examining the arrest itself. Not the legality, but the velocity, because velocity can mask gaps. And gaps are where truth hides. Now let's talk about the cost of speed. Once a suspect is arrested and charged, their narrative is overshadowed. Everything they say is filtered through guilt. Every hesitation is suspicious. Every contradiction is incriminating. Which means if someone wanted to tell a more complicated truth, one involving pressure or payment, their credibility is already compromised. And compromised credibility benefits anyone who doesn't want that truth explored. Now consider this possibility. What if the speed of the arrest wasn't about certainty, but about containment? Containing the story, containing the damage, containing the ripple effects. Because ripple effects are unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of control. Now let's connect this to what came next. As legal teams entered the picture, a different pace emerged. Slower, more deliberate, more cautious. Defense attorneys began asking questions that hadn't been prioritized. About communications, about finances, about third parties. And that's when resistance appeared. Not overt, procedural, requests delayed, access limited, focus redirected. Nothing illegal, just controlled. And control, once again, is the theme that refuses to leave this case. So let's leave this chapter with the question that matters most. Was the arrest fast because the case was clear? Or was it fast because clarity was needed, whether or not it truly existed? Because once you consider that possibility, the next phase of this story becomes unavoidable. The alleged confession, the mention of payment, the suggestion of influence. Those aren't loose threads. They're warnings. Warnings that the story everyone accepted might only be the surface. And when investigators finally slowed down enough to examine those warnings, they realized something unsettling. The speed that brought closure to the public may have delayed the truth. And the next chapter begins where speed can no longer hide what was missed. Because when investigators turned back to the evidence with fresh eyes, they didn't start with the crime scene. They started with the words. The words spoken under pressure. The words that didn't fit. The words that hinted at a transaction no one wanted to acknowledge. And once those words were taken seriously, the case stopped moving forward. It began moving inward, toward a confession that wasn't as simple as it sounded. What if the most dangerous words in this case weren't screamed, but spoken calmly? Because screams fade, but calm statements linger. They echo. They change how everything else is interpreted. I was paid to do this. Those 6 words, simple, flat, almost hollow, are the axis around which this entire case turns. Not because they prove anything on their own, not because they magically reveal the truth, but because they don't belong to the story everyone was so eager to tell. They don't fit rage. They don't fit loss of control. They don't fit a sudden emotional collapse. They fit a transaction. And transactions are deliberate. So let's talk about how this phrase allegedly entered the case. Not through a dramatic press conference. Not through an official statement read at a podium. But quietly. In rooms without cameras. In conversations that weren't meant to leave the building. According to accounts that later surfaced, the statement emerged during questioning. Not as a grand confession, but as a clarification. That distinction matters. Because a confession implies ownership. A clarification implies context. Now imagine the environment in which this happens. A sterile room. Harsh lighting. Hours blurred together. A person already isolated by family narrative, by public expectation, by the speed of the arrest. Someone who has been told, explicitly or implicitly, that the story is already decided. And then a question is asked. Why? Why did this happen? And instead of an emotional answer, a shocking one emerges. I was paid to do this. No shouting, no breakdown, no theatrics, just a statement. And that's what unnerves investigators. Because people confess out of guilt all the time. But people rarely volunteer information that complicates their own case. unless they believe the complication matters. Now stop and think. If you were in that room, would you say those words unless you believe they were important? Unless you believe they explained something essential? Unless you believe they shifted responsibility?